the opportunity for this conference to be is an invitation for the School of Diplomacy and the university as a whole to position itself in a way that makes meaning relevant to many. For some, the university is a place to get trained, be ready to get a job. For others, it's a place where you can work, do your professional commitment. But for some others, the university is a living legacy. It's like a tree. It's a living organism that gives life to a lot, to many, all around. Trees are not only important for themselves, they're also important for the environment that they create, that they contribute to, for the air that they purify, but also for all the life that in a way depends on the tree. And there is one particular process that is very, very important, where humans literally depend on the tree, that is knowledge. There are many things that simply could not be done if there is no appropriate knowledge. There are many things that become dangerous when the knowledge is ignored. There are things that become dangerous for everybody. When I discover that a certain chemical is actually dangerous to the environment as a whole, and I don't pay attention to it, and I leave it in the environment, I may not know who is going to die because of my carelessness, and I can continue to find myself totally innocent because I will never know who is going to die. But was I really innocent once I knew that that chemical was there and that somebody could die if I didn't intervene? So there is no doubt to all of you here, there is no doubt to many, but unfortunately, there is still lots of ignorance outside this little group that slavery today is still happening. That slavery today is still a source of profit for many. That many are literally making money out of the lives of others. That people will die sooner, younger, sicker, because somebody is working them to death, controlling their body, controlling their minds, controlling their relationships, making it impossible for them to move, to speak, to meet, as it is our right, our inalienable right. So why are we in a university speaking at something that is obvious? Of course, slavery is wrong. Because there is another piece of knowledge that needs to be shared. That slavery can be abolished not just in law, not just in principle, but in fact, for the people that are slaves today, in a way that will impact the people that are slaves today, that will punish the perpetrator that are making others slaves today. We are not speaking about 100 years ago. We are not speaking about 100 miles ago. We are speaking about South Orange, New Jersey, the US, this earth, this common home that we have, the only place we have. It's a place that is poisoned by the decision of few to keep making profit out of the slavery of others. It is intolerable to me, it is intolerable to this university, and it is intolerable to the organizer of this conference. I want to thank them and all the speakers and all the participants to make this clear to the Seton Hall community and in particular to the School of Diplomacy. because we want to be committed to make slavery impossible, not just illegal, impossible, wrong, something that is not done anymore, something that nobody will be able to do anymore, not just illegal in name, but in practical, wrong, for the goodness of everyone. The School of Diplomacy is committed to the good of all, not just of mine, not just of us, but everyone. And we believe that the commitment to anti-slavery work is essential. Welcome all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate the inspirational welcome, and so often you hear an invitation from the host organization and it wanders off into realms irrelevant to the subject. But the Dean, I think, was right on the money about the subject matter today. One ministerial matter: if you have friends who are either available to use Facebook or YouTube, this conference is available on Facebook or YouTube. The Facebook address, which is also written behind me, is facebook.com/NJHumanTrafficking. The YouTube address is YouTube CZJ uppercase Y S uppercase G W uppercase Y I W I M uppercase A, again written behind me. So if you text your friends, cousins, relatives, especially the ones that don't want to be here, and tell them they should tune in and listen to some of the things that are going to be said, it would be your first step in organizing today against slavery. I guess I should introduce myself, although I'm the least important voice you will hear today. My name is Raymond Brown, and along with my wife Wanda, who is over here, we're the co-founders of the International Justice Project, one of the co-sponsors of this event. Wanda, would you stand up so people can see you? Oh, please. So if at some point you want to talk to her about the IJP or slavery or about the Trafficking Coalition, please approach her at any time. And she's really the adult in our organization, so if it's an important conversation, you should have it with her. How we came to be here is interesting. The IJP was founded about 2006 when we were teaching here at the School of Diplomacy, and students chose to help us, first in representing an accused at the Special Court of Sierra Leone, and then subsequently as we represented victims before the International Criminal Court. We have since then engaged in many other human rights activities. And in about 2009, about 2011, we started to hear a great deal about the New Jersey Anti-Trafficking Coalition and many of the member organizations with which we had relationships. And a couple of years later, they asked us to join in a fight against Backpage, which, as you know, was an organization that was active in promoting and legally promulgating sex trafficking, especially of children. And we engaged in some fights. We lost some battles and we won some others. And ultimately, the coalition, in which we played a tiny role, sought and obtained amendments to the Communications Decency Act. Along the way, we had become increasingly concerned that nationally there's a great deal of energy focused on the trafficking of children, and slave trafficking in particular. And although it is vitally, morally, and legally important challenge, it's only one part of the slavery picture, and numerically a relatively small part. And we had an interest and a thought about beginning to expand our focus and that of our allies within the Anti-Trafficking Coalition. And then at a meeting, Wanda met Bob Boneberg, from whom you'll hear more, and who was really the guy who sparked this conference. And Bob was a person who shared a similar commitment to broadening the scope of what the Anti-Trafficking Coalition was doing. It has been so effective in the area that it's chosen to work in. It's hard, if you care about the broad slavery question, not to want to entice that organization to work more broadly on trafficking issues. And so Bob became, among other things, the chair of the Anti-Slavery Slave Commerce Committee of the Anti-Trafficking Coalition, and we began to talk to him about ways in which we might begin to spark organizing around that issue. I will tell you that my own interest in part is spawned by the fact that I'm the great-grandchild of chattel slaves here in America. I'm an African American. And I have a little grandson who's 5 who one day will have to hear from me about our history and also about the continued existence of slavery in the world. And being an independent, troublesome little fellow, I expect him to say, well, Grandpa, what are you doing about it if it still exists? And I hope to be able to tell him that starting this day with you and Bob and the splendid people we've assembled here to talk about it, this was a day when we began to kick off some efforts to deal with this very troublesome continued presence in our world. Although it's easy to talk historically about the United States' struggle against slavery and 600,000 deaths to bring about constitutional change, the reality is that one of the great issues at the turn of the last century, from the 19th to the 20th, I'm showing my age by saying that's the last turn of the century, was the question of slavery, along with the question of suffrage and the question of the possibility of world peace. And there was the beginning of the struggle and a number of anti-slavery conventions. But the real boost comes after World War II, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, responding to the use of slave labor by the Japanese Empire and the Third Reich, questioned and challenged and ultimately brought about a worldwide agreement among governments that slavery is morally reprehensible and unacceptable at all times, legally, ethically, and morally. And also in Article 23, that the right to just and fair compensation were also fundamental human rights. And shortly after that agreement and the development of a number of regimes, one of the important regimes is a set of conventions put out by the ILO, the International Labor Organization. And we don't expect you to read all those conventions this afternoon. Instead, we thought we'd show you just a little bit of a very short video that the ILA has produced on this subject. Show you that because in part of our challenge is to learn how to galvanize people who haven't and find ways of explaining to them what is this.
At Terminal 3, Officer Lisa Lee has stopped a Canadian woman who...
Yes? Okay. Wanda will no doubt upbraid me for that slip. I expect you to say, he's innocent. Not my fault. Thank you, Lou. The next thing I want to do is bring you a delightful treat. And that treat is in the form of a human being. Her name is Elise Grew, and I labor to be able to give her an adequate introduction to you. I will tell you that she is one of the most dedicated and finest human rights workers in the world. I don't mean just the United States or just Canada where she was born or just the Americas, but I mean throughout the world. About a decade ago, people that we work with in international law circles and human rights circles began to tell us, you gotta meet Elise, you gotta meet Elise. So much so it became disgusting. I mean, does she walk on water? Can she leap tall buildings at a single bound? In fact, seated in the front row here, by total coincidence, is a good friend of mine who is one of the foremost human rights activists in the world, Nancy Hollander, who has fought at Guantanamo and other places, great battles for human rights. So Nancy, will you stand up and let everybody acknowledge you? I didn't know Nancy was coming today, but she was one of the people who harassed Wanda and I about meeting Elise. And I said, who is this Elise? Why should we meet her? And people said, she's eloquent, she's dynamic, she's driven, she is deeply committed. And finally, we were teaching at Vancouver at the Naval Academy on human rights, and a mutual friend came up to us and said, you must, once again, meet this woman, Elise. And I wanted to spit on his shoe because I'd heard it so often. And we got home and he bombarded us with emails, and it turns out he was bombarding Elise with emails. And so she and her husband Lou came up to New Jersey to meet us, and the four of us, this is meant in the sense of agape, fell in love, in the sense of believing that we were on a similar path. And among the things she talked about with great passion was business and human rights. In fact, she drafted us onto the ABA's task force on business and human rights. And as we worked with Elise more and more, it was clear that she was in touch with people in the movement, both lawyers and non-lawyers and activists around the world. She is dynamic, she is articulate, she is committed, and when Bob Bohnberg said to us, we really need to get somebody who's going to spark us and inspire us to do what has to be done, Wanda and I spontaneously said, the only person that can fit the bill is Elise Grew. Elise?
Well, those are certainly very big shoes to fill. Thank you so much, my friend. I mean, I'm almost embarrassed because I'm sure I'm not going to be up to your expectations after what Ray said. So Ray and Wanda did invite me to come talk to you about modern slavery. They knew I was working in that field in many jurisdictions, and we've been working on many projects together. So let me tell you, it's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here. And I want to say that on top of being very distinguished criminal and international human rights lawyers, Ray and Wanda are also extraordinarily dedicated human beings to human rights. And I had heard about them in as eloquent terms as Ray says he heard about me. So it's a great honor to be here. I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I must say also that Ray and Wanda were very influential in my path to becoming a U.S. citizen. I became a U.S. citizen in December 2015 when I had the pleasure of pledging allegiance with Obama looking at me. And well, as you know, everything changed. Anyway, I'm relatively new to U.S. politics and to American life at the same time as I've been married to an American for 35 years, Lou, who's here, and Lou, who's absolutely passionate about politics and history and American institutions, and in particular, very, very passionate about slavery. I mean, the horror of slavery that at every dinner with our children, Lou spoke about these issues. So he kind of educated me and brought these issues to my conscience to another level than they had been in my life. So it's become a passion for me, and I'm very, very happy to be here with you. So I'm here among a very qualified group of experts in modern slavery and in trafficking, a group from the church, from community leaders, from the whole community of the anti-trafficking movements, and I assume that you're all both experts and leaders, so I'm very happy to be with you. What I want to share with you today is my global perspective, because I travel and work in many jurisdictions. As I said, I'm an international lawyer, so I started my career, like Ray and Wanda, as a defense lawyer. I was a public defender for many years. Then I became an international criminal lawyer with my dear Nancy, that I've met at the NACDL in 2001, I think it was, and we've been working together ever since. And I started to build a practice as an international human rights lawyer, and more specifically in a very new field that you may or may not have heard about, which is called business and human rights and sustainable business. So this is a field where we bring together, or try to bring together, business and human rights lawyers, which seems like almost a misnomer because usually they're in very opposite camps. So this is a new area that's getting to be recognized as a field of practice, in particular in London, where the practical guides of business lawyers recognize this field. And one of the key areas of business and human rights is modern slavery. And I will explain to you why I call it modern slavery rather than human trafficking. So my work brings me a lot to the UK, where I'm a member of a chambers, again with Nancy. I work with fantastic human rights barristers in London, which is called Doughty Street Chambers. And I also work a lot in France because I became a licensed lawyer in France. French is my mother tongue. And I work in the Netherlands. So I work with a variety of groups on these issues. And I'm here to try to establish links with you, to try to invite you to join bigger groups or other groups than the ones you're already involved in, and to find ways to better our involvement with business and our involvement with government to get them to act very urgently on these issues. And I hope that we'll engage in fruitful dialogue and cooperation for a long time to come. So where does modern slavery fit in this universe? It fits in the global economy, what I call the savage globalization. It's an issue that's been affecting our modern society. It has received a lot of attention in the last few years because of the fast pace of globalization and the economy that's been growing so fast. And it's been inflicting so much harm because it's been so unregulated. And the globalization has not enabled political and legal institutions to catch up. So economy is gone faster than the political and legal institutions. So it's increased pressures on market to produce more and more and more in a cheaper way, faster, all the time. And it's become really a systemic issue. So I think this is the base of what we need to agree upon. It's brought a lot of people out of the worst poverty, in particular in Asia, in Bangladesh, in India, and China, Cambodia, Thailand, South Korea, and many other places. But while it brought some people out of dire poverty, it made them work in horrendous conditions. For many workers who have to produce, as we saw in the image, very fast, very cheap goods for consumers who are demanding more all the time and who want to change clothes every month, who wants the new things, the new product. And that has an incredible cost on people who are trying at the bottom of the supply chain to produce these goods while corporations' profits are soaring. And they've been soaring more and more in the last 20 years. So this is becoming an issue of basic decency, basic human rights, and basic democracy and rule of law. And I'll come back to that. But this unregulated capitalism has escaped, as I said, the legal and political frame, and it's created what John Ruggie, the special rapporteur of the United Nations appointed by Kofi Annan in 2005, the governance gaps, these huge governance gaps that are not regulated. Modern slavery thrives in cities, in regions, in countries where you find these governance gaps. So let's take a quick look at the global labor market. There is a growth of market for labor, a demand for more and more labor everywhere. And the multinational corporations, they have gained the global market power that enables them to turn to local production in countries that compete for each other to offer a more attractive labor force. So national companies in these countries are offering contracts at lower and lower price, bidding on paying their workers less and less and less. And that's happening in commodities like steel, in garments, and business strategy is driven by the obsession of cost efficiency. I'm sure you have all heard about that, but the impact of cost efficiency is first and foremost on the workers at the bottom of that race. So the iconic example of that is Rana Plaza, that building that collapsed in April 2013, where many brands had been oblivious to the fact that they were subcontracting their brands to suppliers who were not respecting any standards of security, any standards of safety for the workers. People who were around Rana Plaza knew it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. And the big brands felt comforted because they were sending auditors to the premises who were saying everything is fine, there's no problem, don't worry about it. The building had been certified 3 weeks before, and it collapsed. Then you have the large flow of migrants to construction sites, again, like we see in the ILO movie. And I commend to you to look at a movie called The Workers' Cup, if you've heard about it. I mean, that's a movie that's easy to find, I'm sure, on YouTube, but that's a movie that describes what's happening in Qatar, which is another iconic example. And you have the Thai fishing industry that I'm sure you've heard about, the conditions in which these fishermen in Thailand are kept in water up to 20, 22 hours. And I mean, they're dispensable like the nets, basically. I mean, nobody cares about their fate. And on top of that, you have mass migration because of all the violence that's been happening in the Middle East, all the violence that's happening in Central America, in Venezuela now, and Mexico a lot. So all these people are fleeing extreme poverty, extreme violence. They need a place where they can survive. And that's why they're ready to take the sea and die by the thousands, as we've seen in the Mediterranean, or all these incredible migrants that come here with families that are arrested at the border, separated from their children, when they didn't come for fun. They came because there was no other alternative. I mean, they had to find a place to move to. And I mean, that's the way that we have treated them, which makes me feel that we have fallen far from civilization in this instance. So the opposition to this globalization has been happening in two ways. It's been happening in a civilized way, where you've had a lot of experts who have been getting together to denounce modern slavery as something uncivilized. You also have the business and human rights community that's been developing around the guidelines adopted by the UN in 2011 that says business have a responsibility to respect human rights. States have a responsibility to protect, but business have a responsibility to respect human rights. And business and states have to come together to offer remedies to the affected populations, to mitigate the consequences of their operations, the damage they're creating to the environment. And this is the framework that's bringing every NGOs, and I invite you to participate, to the UN Forum every year at the end of November. It's free. It's a concert of like-minded people fighting in this field. This year it's going to be 26th to 28th of November. The registration are open on the UN site, and people come together to discuss these issues and look at solutions. And you have economic leaders, you have business leaders, and you have governments that are participating. I've been urging my friends, Ray and Wanda, to come to the Geneva Forum. They haven't been there yet, but I hope they will be there this year. So, facing the civilized approach to globalization, you have what I call the uncivilized approach, which is authoritarian national movements that promise workers that feel they've been cheated by globalization, blue-collar workers, workers in general, for whom the immigrants become the enemy that we have to get rid of, like vermin, and that these people, I mean, promise them a protection, promise them that they'll close the border. They attack anxiety that way. So, I mean, again, we've seen what Trump has tried to do in this country. We've seen it in Italy. We've seen it in Hungary, which is really a very bad example right now in the world. We're seeing it in Poland. We saw 20% of these fascists voting in Sweden recently, in Germany. in Austria, in France, in the Netherlands. Brexit was also animated around the same fear of the immigrants, fear of the others. So this is like a very global movement that I called very uncivilized, which is a dramatic response to globalization, to which we're not going to escape. We have to tackle globalization. We have to frame it in a way that is acceptable. It's not just bad, because it did bring work to people who needed that work. So this cause for civilization, I think, is a huge opportunity for us to get together and to fight back. And I'm going to say to all, please go vote on November 6th. I think this is the most important election of your lifetime. So what is modern slavery? Modern slavery and human trafficking are plights that affect up to not 2 million people like on that video, but more like 47 million people. So the figures vary from groups to groups, but the index, which is one of the most reliable NGO, is talking about 47 million. Among these 47 million, you have 21 million children. I mean, like forced labor by children. So modern slavery is an umbrella that covers slavery, servitude, debt bondage, forced labor, compulsory labor, and human trafficking. So human trafficking is part of modern slavery. Victims are unable to leave their situation of exploitation. They're controlled by threats, by punishment, by violence, by coercion, by deception. Slaveries violate human rights, denying people their rights to life, to freedom, and to security. Modern slavery affects almost every country, either as a source country where victims are coming from, a transit country where they're traveling through, or a destination where they're enslaved. What is the common thread? The common thread is coercion or compulsion to perform work without pay, or extremely low pay, and working in extremely dangerous conditions, as you'll see in the PowerPoint that was prepared. People working in mines in conditions where you wouldn't even want to put your pet. The conditions are so atrocious and so dangerous. And they're migrants. They're often trapped in homework and domestic work, like we've seen in the Middle East, where the owners will even go as far as cutting limbs of their workers if they're trying to escape. And I mean, in the construction sites, we've seen it again. I invite you to see that very, very compelling movie called The Workers' Cup, and where the passports are being confiscated, so they have no way of leaving. I mean, they're not enslaved like in the 19th centuries, but they have no way of leaving. And where do we find that kind of labor? We find it in plantation fields, including sugar, coffee, tea, cocoa, artisanal mines, factories, private homes, nail spas, which is one of the main targets of the UK Modern Slavery Act, cyber networks, marching clients to underage girls and boys, as you said. I mean, that network that was trying to march the kids to these networks. It does not only cover sexual services, though sexual coercion may be part of the package, where young girls and boys are being offered to clients by their employers. Many people still believe today that slavery ended in the 19th century, so that it's not an issue, that it's gone. And the International Labor Organization started to work on that to show, no, this is not an issue that's gone. It's an issue that covers, as I said, an estimate of 45.8 million people, and these are estimates. And I assume that it's probably much higher than that. One of the big challenges, as you all know, is detection. Modern slavery is illegal, it is criminal, it's happening in many countries, but it's so hard to detect because the traffickers operate black and gray markets in human labor, the kind of thing we saw in the movie. It's a big global industry. Numbers are hard to estimate. It is not like the legalized slavery that prevailed in the 19th century, but the black market and human trafficking is thriving today. It's full of operators, skilled professionals operating businesses, employers, labor brokers, traffickers. They have powerful economic incentive to remain invisible and below the radar. And this is the challenge, is detection. How do we detect these people, which is different from classic abolition movement, which I'm not trying to minimize in any way whatsoever. I mean, I'm just trying to recognize the phenomenon that is hidden while slavery before was wide in the open. So the revenue, and you'll see it also in the movie, is estimated at $150 billion a year of revenue from modern slavery, which is enormous, an enormous amount of money. So how do we frame the issue? And I'd like to try to get this discussion going with you. I feel that here in the US, we tend to frame the issue like under sex trafficking, the women being trafficked, especially underage girls, and also boys, of course, by criminal organizations and network. The primary focus is on criminal law and on enforcement. In Europe, it's different. And in the UN, it's different. It's focused around labor issues. It's seen as a labor problem, which doesn't mean criminal law is not involved. Of course it's involved. And of course, each time we can prosecute owners or people who make people work like slaves. But it's first seen as a labor issues that occur in legal and illegal industries, licit and illicit. Like child workers in mines are considered to be victims the same way as underage sex workers. And what is the purpose of making these people work like that? Profit, money, economic conditions. The focus is labor and enforcement of international labor standards, including legal prohibition on slavery. So I don't want to oversimplify the focus on human trafficking and criminal law that prevails in the US, but I do want to show you that there's another system that's prevailing in Europe, and that's around the standards of the ILO and in the UN system as well. And they're not in contradiction. They're complementary, but the labor issue focuses the fact that modern slavery is happening because of the economic system. When we just focus on criminal law, we're looking at it as a crime, and we are forgetting that it's part of a system, a much bigger system, which is the economic system. The ILO developed core conventions on these issues, on the elimination of all forms of forced labor and compulsory labor, including traditional slavery, abolition of child labor, elimination of discrimination in employment and occupations, and freedom of association and recognition of the right to collective bargaining. These ILO conventions were adopted between 1930 and 1999, and they're presented by the ILO as a package. So eliminating forced labor and child labor is framed as part of the broader cause for promoting equity and labor rights in the workplace. And I'll give you an example. Following Rana Plaza, there were two movements, one in North America, one in Europe, to establish some kind of supervision of what was going on in the factories, specifically focused on safety and security. And in the US, we had the Alliance that was led by Walmart. In Europe, they had the Accord. The Accord had about 225 brands. The difference between the two groups, and it's too bad the two groups didn't work together because they would have been so much more powerful, was that in Europe, they favored the unions. They favored creating collective bargaining and representation for these workers at the bottom of the global supply chain. And in the US, there was no way that Walmart was going to support anything that approached labor, collective bargaining, and labor unions. So they each went their way. And the Accord did remarkable work. I haven't followed as much the work that was done by the Alliance. So the 4 principles of the ILO is to create a social floor for the global economy under which you cannot go, social ground rules for globalization, where we all agree that these are unacceptable conditions in which you cannot ask anyone to work. So that is a difference. In a way, I would say it's more positive because it's not based only on prohibitions. It's built on best ways to do business, best ways to develop the economy and to do it all together. So I find that inspirational. The declaration is soft law. It's an instrument in the UN, similar to the UN declaration quoted by Ray, but it's a very solid instrument. And I invite you, I don't have time here today, to look at the relationship of the US with the ILO, which is a very complicated relationship. So what are the challenges? The issue of modern slavery has been on the agenda for 20 years or more. And there are many conventions, as I said, and global guidelines. The key challenge is enforcement and implementation of principles of the labor standards. I mean, we have to agree on these labor standards and work towards their implementation worldwide. So it's a complex global problem. We cannot rely on traditional regulations and criminal law enforcement because these are tools designed for national jurisdictions, while these labor issues are really international. We live the same problem in international criminal law. I mean, we were developing an international criminal justice system for the world, and we were trying to deal with it at the national level, and there were so many gaps. So who are the key players? The NGOs, the labor movement, the government, of course, business, and the facilitating stakeholders, which are actors, media, whistleblowers, and workers. So what is happening? I'm turning my back on you. I just realized. I'm so sorry. I've been like that. I'm going to turn here. So the NGO and the labor movement also has been supported by the academic. I mean, so in the 1990s, as the Cold War ended, Kofi Annan, who unfortunately left us in August, spoke about the NGO revolution. And the movement to end modern slavery is a perfect example of what he meant, because the NGOs have been leading the way here. There's no doubt that NGOs and the ILO and the unions, international unions, started exposing this problem as far back as in the 90s. The ILO, they've put forward together with decades of hard work, and the NGOs, portraying modern slavery as the most horrendous global problem it is, and that we're all coming to realize it is. Advocates have encountered a lot of resistance because the opposition was saying, you're talking to us about a phenomenon that's disappeared, that's gone, that doesn't exist. It existed in the 19th century. It's been abolished. And so the challenge is to say, no, unfortunately, it's not gone. We have to expose it. We have to show it still exists. And that's how we can combat it together. I mean, and my message is really for us to come together with all the tools that we have to combat this as much as we can. There are hundreds of NGOs dealing with this issue, many in the UK, many in the US, many in other parts of the world. What about government? What are governments doing in this field? Most of the time, the action of government has been around criminal cases. They've been initiating prosecutions. But the NGOs have pressed the governments to adopt new laws, and new laws are starting to emerge in many different jurisdictions to create higher labor standards and be more aggressive in policy enforcement and law enforcement. So the laws that have been passed lately that are interesting is the law of reporting. It started with the California Transparency Act, and then in Europe they adopted a general standard of reporting where companies have to show what they're doing against slavery. They have to show how they're acting to detect the victims and to ban imports of certain goods coming from certain areas. You've all heard about conflict diamonds, conflict minerals, and lumbers. There's a new regulation coming up in Europe about conflict lumbers. The core focus has to be on the transparency of the supply chain. And this is hard to achieve. This is hard work. We all have to be very convinced that this is the way to go, because there is a lot of resistance on the part of corporations. They're very worried to expose themselves to any form of liability. And there, as a lawyer, I will tell you that lawyers are often the culprit of that resistance. They're putting walls between the world and the corporation, making it impossible to have any form of liability. I'm sure you've been a witness to that. And we have to work on changing that mentality and engaging. Lots of compliance have been developing, compliance obligations in many jurisdictions, moving it into the sphere of law. But compliance is not enough. Compliance doesn't bring the engagement that's necessary to really know what's happening at the bottom of the supply chain. We have to go on the ground and talk to these people who have no voice, and we have to go and go again and go back, create a climate of trust, saying we're here to understand your problems, and we're here to try to find solutions to solve these problems together. Instead, compliance just is kind of hygienic. You send auditors, they come, they go visit a factory, and the people in the factory are prepared to receive them, and they show them a perfect picture. They show them things are working so well here, don't know why you have any worry. This is perfect. And everybody knows it's not like that, but the people on the ground are so worried to lose their job. The competition is so fierce that that's the way it's happening. And Rana Plaza was a very good example. So the UK adopted in 2015 a law on modern slavery. I've had the pleasure to work with the commissioner in England, Commissioner Hyland, who's a remarkable man, who's made it his mission in life. He's a former from Scotland Yard, and he's made it his mission to fight modern slavery. So he's traveling the world, and he's gone to see the Pope, and he's gotten the support of the Pope, and he's an extraordinary crusader. So the Modern Slavery Act law requires companies to say, okay, we have a supply chain. What do we do in the supply chain? How do we find our slaves? But unfortunately, out of the FTSE 100, the corporations that are quoted on the Financial Times Index, only like about 50% have been doing an okay job of reporting. The others, they have done a very, very superficial job. So Commissioner Hyland writes to them and say, can you please fill your obligations and tell me what you're doing to fight modern slavery? And they have to do it every year, so they have to show progress from one year to the next. And they're not responding to him. They're not replying. And in the current context in the UK, which had taken a step in the good direction in 2015, with the Brexit looming over, now the government is so worried about losing business and displeasing business that they are not doing anything anymore. So unfortunately, that extraordinary commissioner resigned his job in the summer of 2018. He's now working with the Children Foundation in Ireland. He's still completely involved, but he left the job because he felt he couldn't do, and he had been working for 4 years towards doing something in that field. Yes. So then you have France, who, following Rana Plaza, took the lead and adopted a law in 2017 that was confirmed by the constitutional courts, which is called devoir de vigilance, duty of vigilance, which means duty of care. It's the same thing as the duty of care. So that law is the one that goes the furthest. That law is demanding that corporations adopt a plan, that they make that plan public, that they put it on their website, that they publish it, and that the plan has to be effective to fight human rights violation, environmental violations, safety and security in the supply chain. And fundamental freedom is also included in that law. And to produce that plan, they have to work with the stakeholders, which means the affected populations, which means the labor unions, which means all the people involved. And so far, there's a lot of resistance still It's a very new law, and it's very hard to make corporations and corporate lawyers understand the difference between human rights due diligence and risk enterprise due diligence. Risk enterprise due diligence is the risk to the corporation. That's very easy for them to understand. But human rights due diligence is the impact a corporation has on the humans, on the population affected by that. So this is a very important law. We're very much hoping this law is going to develop the way it should. I have written extensively on that law, but in French, and I'm working right now with Georgetown Law to translate that into English, because we want to show how this law will help settle the notion of settle is a big word, to try to improve the expansion of the duty of care, which is necessary. I had a lunch with the ABA 2 days ago, and they asked me, what would be your wish, dream, legally in this field? And I said, to have a law that would define the duty of care that corporations have to follow in this field, that's clear, that lawyers cannot escape it and courts cannot escape it, because that's the duty of care of a corporation. So the other player in this field, and there's the U.S. Trade Facilitation Act too, we can talk about that. Briefly, I also want to touch on the sustainable goals, the development goals of the United Nations. They were adopted in 2000 to eradicate poverty, and in 2015 they adopted new sustainable goals known as SDGs. And in particular, SDG 8.7, that states that the UN takes immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and the use of child soldiers, and that by 2025, end child labors in all its forms. So that's the aspirational goal 8.7. Commissioner Highland told me very proudly that he had participated in the drafting of this and that he had taken it to the Pope and gotten his support. The very important player in this field, of course, is the business. Business has a huge role to play, and governments could demand tomorrow morning, we're not going to have supply chains full of slaves. We will not accept this kind of procurement anymore. And under Obama, they had started to want to clean the procurement of the U.S. government. But for that, you cannot do it without business, because the products are produced by business, the services are offered by business, so they have to work together. And briefly, I mean, as I said, you find these clusters of slaves in different countries that are known. I mean, in poor countries that will generate shady recruitment practices with illegal fees and debt bondage. The business has to decide that they want to know what's happening in their supply chain and not say, oh, we're only liable for first tier, which is nonsense. If they stop at first tier, they cannot know what's going on. So, as I said, the human rights due diligence is a tool that's being developed. I think it's an extremely important tool that we need to work on together, because it involves all the players. It involves the workers, it involves the UN, it involves the NGOs, the civil society, and of course it involves business. And as I often say, lawyers on both sides, the human rights lawyers and the business lawyers, have to learn to work together. They have to learn to engage to solve these problems at the root. And again, I invite you to find ways. I mean, I'm happy to stay in touch. I'm happy to continue working with you and finding ways to develop initiatives that are worldwide, so that they have a lot of impact and that we have as much leverage as we can. This is a collective responsibility that involves as much business as it involves government, as it involves civil society. So we all need to work together on these issues, and finance is a key component of that. So we need to work with investors, invite investors to demand this kind of responsibility, educate people, educate boards of directors that they can make a difference by demanding transparent supply chain. If not, liability is going to eventually bounce back on them. Because the number of laws that are developing in this field are very diverse. Some are very stringent, others are very soft, but they're developing side by side. So I call that a galaxy, a kind of a legal galaxy where each law is a system on its own, but it's interacting with the next system, so it's expanding. And we don't know when the next liability is going to come around. So I'm going to stop at that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Elise is a tour de force, as you can see. There are a few people more knowledgeable on this subject or more passionate about it. One of the things that I thought of when I saw that ILO animation at the beginning came to mind when Elise was speaking, and that is, who knows where the 2022 World Cup is going to be? Nobody? Not a single person? Qatar, right. And one of the biggest areas of concern with respect to slave labor and forced labor is Qatar. So I'll be conflicted between wanting to watch the World Cup and knowing that much of the construction has been done using forced labor. And indeed, there's much evidence that Sochi and the spots for the Winter Olympics were the subject of much forced labor. Now, if I look like I'm lost, it is because there's a video I want to show. I'm closing it. I closed it before. Can you get it while I'm talking? Okay. So let me tell you what I want to do next. I want to show you a brief video, about 4.5 minutes, that reflects some of the human aspects of the labor circumstances we're talking about. And in addition to that, while I dismantle the entire podium, I thought I would tell you about how I want this to go. Contrary to the program, which sets out speeches for the panelists, I'm not going to do that. I want to imagine that Wanda invited Elizabeth and Mary Beth and Bob to our home for breakfast. And we're sitting around talking about what Elise said and what this subject is, and most importantly, what can be done going forward, as opposed to more speeches. Not that they wouldn't be splendid speeches, but an opportunity to really focus on the question Raymond has to have, the answer he has to have for his grandson when he says, "What'd you do, Grandpa?" Let me focus on something. Okay. It seems if I just touch one button, I can show you the video and nothing else will happen bad. So this is a video which will give you some graphic notions about labor conditions that we're talking about.
The small, practiced hands of a 6-year-old. Shamil is breaking rocks at an Indian mine so that the Western world can sparkle. He and his fellow workers are mining mica. Among other things, this crystalline rock is used to make pearlescent paint for luxury cars. It is also what gives cosmetics the shimmer that's so in vogue these days. The largest mica deposits in the world are here in the Kaderma district of Jharkhand province. And yet, according to the locals, all the mining in this area is illegal. The miners have no protection whatsoever. Everybody was reluctant to have us record these pictures. Soon after filming these women and more children at work, the supervisors at this mine chased us away. The dirt-poor workers were wary too. Exploited though they are, they feel they have no choice but to tolerate their circumstances. The beauty business has fallen in love with mica, in part because it's a natural product and its extraction is supposedly environmentally friendly. The problem is it's anything but people-friendly. Indeed, mica's extraction is downright dangerous. Deep into the earth they dig. All that glitters down here may as well be gold, for getting their hands on it is the only livelihood available. Chipping away without any shoring up means cave-ins are commonplace. A recent study concluded that on average 5 children die in these mines every month. The number of adults killed is greater, but there's no record of it. 9 out of 10 fatalities are never reported because of the unwelcome attention they might bring.
We have asked the government time and again to give us licenses to mine mica, which is the only means of support for everyone here. But government has done nothing.
We've seen young children working in the mines. That's illegal in India.
No, kids don't go to mines. The parents work at the mines and the kids go to school. Not a single child works at the mines.
Denial like that ensures this mica production continues unchecked and unregulated. Tons of it are coming out of the mines every day. The mica goes through many hands and markups in value as it makes its way from here to the port of Kolkata to be shipped to all over the world.
England है, जापान है, अमेरिका है, सब तो जाए भी करते हैं.
England, Japan, America, it goes far and wide, but I don't know what they use it for, said this middleman. Nobody asks too many questions about this hidden industry. Many of the mines are deep in the forest. If you follow trails of sparkling mica, you can find them. But by and large, they remain out of sight and out of mind. Illegal, dangerous, and anything but child-friendly. For the world's make-up business, it's hardly a pretty picture. John Irvine, News at 10, Jharkhand Province, India.
The point here, which we need not belabor, is that seemingly benign products like, what's the matter, Greg? Oh, okay.
If you write anything on your computer, you need to get Grammarly.
I write pretty much all day, every day.
Why, thank you. Oh, okay. Can I hit the X, Greg? Okay. I think we're safe for the moment. The point of that, of course, is that seemingly benign products like mica for car paint and cosmetics, cocoa beans for chocolate that we might eat every day, that some of you probably have hidden away to take a bite of before this program is over, or these devices that we carry every day. Devices, substances that are in and of themselves harmless, are frequently the subject of slave or forced labor. And we're not aware of it, or when we become aware of it, it seems overwhelming. And so I started to mention my relatively new friend, Bob Boneberg, who's the coordinator of the Slave-Free Community Project, as well as of the Coalition's committee on this subject. And the other day I was talking to him, and he said, when I was talking about what are the kinds of solutions, something that made me want to start at the end of this conversation, because the purpose of this conversation is not just to talk about it in broad terms, but to answer the question, what can we do? And you said, Bob, I asked you about choices, pick a brick, by which I thought you were implying there are a number of different approaches. But since we're here in South Orange, New Jersey, and by the way, I should mention that Kabili Tayari, who was going to be here to talk about procurement, had an emergency today and is unavailable. But we'll cover some of that territory now and more in the next session. But since we're in South Orange, Essex County, New Jersey, Eastern Seaboard, USA, what are a couple of the bricks that you had in mind when you said to me, well, Brown, it's pick a brick?
And the thought of picking a brick is based on an addition to Elise's remarks, because in our judgment, Slave-Free Community Project, and I think the judgment of others, one essential element of the modern anti-slavery movement is the audience here, and the audience who are watching this live stream and people around the world. We are looking here for societal change. We're looking to end in a horrific practice which has existed for 4,000 years of recorded history. As Elise said, it's $150 billion a year in illegal profits. It's going to end, in our judgment, when people say enough is enough. We're not going to have 50 million slaves around, 25 million slaves in forced labor around the world. We're not going to have 50,000 slaves in the land of the free and the home of the brave. We're not going to have cars that are painted with mica that are mined by slaves. We're not going to eat chocolate that to some extent is harvested by slaves.
Bob, you said we're not going to eat chocolate. How many people here are going to stop eating chocolate? I didn't say.
I didn't say
okay.
Stop eating chocolate.
Okay, because that was
I
a
said
big
stop
statement.
eating chocolate that's harvested by slaves, and that ties in.
How many would be willing to do that? Stop eating chocolate that's harvested by slaves. Okay.
And so.
Sorry to interrupt you, Bob.
That's all right. That's all right.
Because I do like my chocolate.
That's I'm confused already, so a little more won't hurt. So the question is, when you hear a discussion about a convention coming to the League of Nations in the 1920s, which worked so well, they put another convention to the UN in the 1950s, all abolishing slavery, and now we're here 60 years later talking about the same issue. So the question is, one of the things I don't want folks to think in the audience is that one has to do everything. And I don't think that's true. But and what I was saying to Ray, it's like you have a field and there's 1 million bricks in the field, and we're saying, well, let's build a cathedral. Well, people don't have to build the cathedral by themselves. And that's when I said to Raymond, just pick a brick. What is it that interests you? And what is it that you can do? And we can start at sometimes people say to all of us here who are active in this and to people in the panel, what can I do immediately today? What can I do immediately today? And I can tell you something you could do immediately today. You go back on a table back there. We're just beginning a public, supported, consumer, slave-free car campaign, which I'm confident will not be welcomed by the car sellers. And what we're saying to them is, we don't want you selling cars until you can, we want you to sell cars, but we want you to confirm that there are no slave-made goods or products in your cars. That seems reasonable enough. You know, I don't particularly want to drive a car where the iron in the chassis was somehow traced back to slaves, or the rubber in the tires is traced back to slaves, or the chips in the computer can be traced back to slaves. So we're just saying, stop that. You want to do something easy, something simple? Go sign one of our postcards. We've got 3 back there to each of the big 3. We're going to be sending them out, and this is how we're ringing their doorbell. We're saying, hello. We're saying, hello. We want you to tell us that you're not selling vehicles made with slaves. But sometimes folks will say to us, I want another brick. I want 2 bricks. Great. I mean, we live, as Raymond said, we live in South Orange. We live in Essex County. We live in New Jersey. We live in the United States. One of the largest consumers of anything in the world are governments. Governments are buying cars. They're buying gold and computers. They're buying all sorts of things. And so one of the things, if this is a brick that appeals to you, is how do we get government to say we're going to regulate our own purchases so we're not buying products that have slave-made goods within them? Great. And so what I'm saying to you, I truly believe that the slavery will come when enough people say it's time to end it. And when they come to business, when they come to government, when they come, and some people may be interested in education in schools, when the schools are teaching it, when it becomes part of our culture. So I don't know who the youngest person here in the room is, but my goal is in about 40 years that someone will say to one of a grandchild of one of the youngest people in this room will say to them, "What was slavery? What is slavery?" And they'll say, "You know, it used to exist. It was terrible. People used to own other people. They'd exploit other people, and we put an end to it. We put an end to it." And I was part of that. I helped put an end to it. And, you know, and maybe they'll say, "You know, I was in college and this old fool came to us and he said, we can work together and end slavery." And you know what? He was right. We're ending it together. And so my suggestion to you is, and we're happy to give you as many bricks as you want to carry, is pick a brick. Help us build the foundation to end modern slavery once and for all.
Elizabeth Molden leads Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, and this morning at breakfast, which Bob bought for us, she was mentioning, or I think Mary Beth asked her about something she was doing on a Yelp-type platform, and it would help us, I think, if you explained it, to learn a little bit about how the recruitment process works in terms of the movement of labor.
Sure. So modern slavery takes a lot of different forms, and Raymond's asking me about migration of workers who are coming to the United States to work. So you've heard a lot already today about the way that goods and products and different items that may be extracted in other places end up within the goods that we find at our grocery store or the cars that we go to buy. But the area of focus for me is labor migration. I work at a binational migrant workers' rights organization called Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, and our work starts in home communities where workers are recruited to come to places like New Jersey. And so, how many of you in the room know about labor recruitment or about the range of visa programs that are out there? Just a show of hands. So some of you do. So there's a real alphabet soup of visas through which workers come to the United States. Usually these are short-term visas where the workers are tied to their employer. So the employer, depending on the visa category, first has to try to find U.S. workers. Some visa categories they don't even have to try. And then that employer usually connects with an attorney or agent here in the United States who connects with a staffing agency or another individual who connects with another person who connects with a recruiter on the ground level in countries all around the world to bring workers here to work. And these workers sometimes come for short-term periods, maybe a few months. Sometimes their visas last for 3 years. But one of the most common abuses that we see in international labor recruitment is the charging of fees. And these recruitment fees are a real gateway to abuses, labor exploitation, and even trafficking and slavery. Workers who arrive here indebted are that much more vulnerable on the job if their passports or documents are confiscated, if they face wage abuse, wage theft, physical abuse, sexual abuse, horrible living and working conditions. Workers who owe money back home are much less likely to come forward and report the abuses that they've experienced. So what that does is perpetuate slavery, labor exploitation, and abuses. So Raymond's asking me about something that we developed at the organization where I work. It's a website called contratados.org, and this website enables workers to write reviews about their experiences with recruiters or employers, and it also enables workers to verify the existence of certain jobs or to see what other workers have said about potential jobs that they're looking at. We see such a range of abuses that happen at the level of recruitment, whether it's discrimination, misrepresentation, fraudulent offers for jobs that don't even exist, that leave workers impoverished in their home communities without even a way to come to work here. But this website, besides offering Know Your Rights training and providing alerts for workers when there are abuses happening in their home communities, also enables them to gain information and gives them the power to make decisions about their own labor recruitment to come to the United States to work.
Can anybody access that?
Yes, yes.
What is it? Where is it located?
It's at contratados.org, which is Spanish for contracted, and you can access this site in either Spanish or English.
So there was a shift. I mentioned World War II, which for some of you is a distant memory. For others, I don't know. I was a war baby, so at least I have some historical contiguity with it. But human rights was initially framed as a concept of limiting what governments can do. Now, in this age of the globalized economy that Elise described, corporations typically have more gross revenue than the GDP of many, many countries. And so their economic and political power is great, and they transcend borders. Now, in the context of that, Elise mentioned the concept of first tier. And for that, a deeper explanation of that, I want to turn to Mary Beth Gallagher, who's the executive director of the Tri-State Coalition for Responsible Investment, which is the second question I'm going to ask you, and also the co-chair of the coalition's Slave-Free Commerce Committee. So I'm deliberately distracting you with PowerPoint because I think there's a slide that Mary Beth might, first one? Okay. Now if I can do this without any help from anybody. Oh. Are you proud of me? Yes, okay. So the question, the car's backwards? Oh, there it is. You see, those of you, that was my wife doubting me. Does that surprise you? Okay. So Mary Beth, Elise used the term first tier.
Mm-hmm.
What is she talking about, and what are the other tiers?
Sure, thanks. So my name is Mary Beth Gallagher, and thanks so much, Elise. I think you framed the conversation.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest Elise didn't know what you're talking about.
No, I know. I think she framed the conversation really well and left us with a lot of different threads to follow. So I'm going to talk in response to Ray's question about tiers and what that means. So essentially, this is the image of a car, and we're looking at the end product, which has rubber tires, shimmery paint. We've just seen that video about mica. It has electronic systems that run its dashboard. It has leather seating in its interior that's luxurious. And we see the end product. But for most of these finalized materials, they're harvested or mined or sourced, manufactured around the globe due to globalization and the cheap cost of labor. That's not always regulated, that's not always legal in other countries. And some of these goods will be 8 or 9 tiers away from the final product where they end in the car. Can you switch to the next one? So to give you a sense of some of what we're talking about, this is a map of the world that's bringing together some of those commodities that end up in the final car and where they're coming from. And what we did here was map data from the U.S. Department of Labor list of goods produced with forced and child labor against those commodities in a car to see these goods that are originating, for example, charcoal from Brazil that ends up in the steel, is identified as known to be produced with forced and child labor at the very bottom of the supply chain where there are charcoal harvested from burning trees. And then it goes from Brazil to a middleman, to a middleman, to a middleman, and finally ends up in your car. And at each one of those middle people in the supply chain, it's a different tier. So the automakers at the end of the tier generally describe their responsibilities as extending to the person who they purchase the steel from as it goes into the car. But the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that Elise described talk about the responsibility really extending throughout all of the business relationships of the car manufacturer. Every relationship where they have leverage, where they're purchasing or procuring or ordering or requiring certain things to be made. And at each of those tiers, the accountability is watered down and sort of doesn't exist or is weakened if it existed at all. So the reason it's so complex is because something originates on a farm in Indonesia and ends up as rubber in your cars, and tracing it along that path is really complicated. And at each of those tiers, there's lack of accountability and oversight for working conditions. Does that help?
Great. So let me ask you a question. Elise, there's been reference to the guiding principles. Who here knows what the guiding principles are? Okay, so a Harvard professor named Ruggie, at the instance of Kofi Annan, went around the world talking to different stakeholders, labor, the term NGOs that's been used, non-government organizations, talking to NGOs, civil society, government people, and came up with a series of guiding principles. But as Elise said, it's soft law. But to the extent that these principles are designed to give guidance, they imply that the company that ultimately manufactures the car is responsible to do due diligence to see what's happening all the way down the chain. Is that right, Elise? So that in theory, you can't, if you're General Motors or Ford, contract away your responsibility and say, oh, that's not my fault. That's the guy who mined the titanium in the DRC. So there is at least an idea about limiting this. So at least I asked you a question and I answered it for myself. That was pretty bad, wasn't it? So let me go back to Bob then. Bob, so I live in South Orange as...
add something to that.
Okay, I thought so.
The tier 1 is the tier by which a company is tied with a contract with its suppliers. The other tiers are subcontractors. So that's why they claim they only have a liability for the contract they sign. And the principles enacted by John Ruggie in his framework is to say you have a responsibility to do no harm. Basically, this is what business and human rights is. So we are not telling you exactly which means to use to do no harm, but we're asking you to take all reasonable steps to do no harm. That is expanded to the OECD, of which I didn't speak, the Organization of Economic and Cooperation in Europe, which, not in Europe, the Organization of Economic and Cooperation Development, the US is an important member of OECD, have developed in parallel with the adoption of the UNGPs another framework for multinational corporations called the Framework for Responsible Business Conduct. So we have moved from the CSR universe, which is the universe of social responsibility, to a more legal universe of corporate conduct. And all that to say that these new laws that I've spoken about are inciting corporations to go to the last tier of their supply chain to see what's going on, because we all know that it's not going to be happening at the first tier.
Right, so going from the mines where mica is being mined in India or titanium coming out of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we're back to pick-a-brick. So Bob, Wanda and I live in South Orange. You live in Maplewood, right?
I do.
And sometimes they make purchases together. So maybe they purchase their police cars every 5 years, or they renew their fleets, right?
Right.
Does that give us an idea about what we might think about in terms of a specific way that you could, for example, take this information that Mary Beth has put on this slide and turn that into talking to the municipal council or the governing body in South Orange or Essex County?
Absolutely. I don't want my local government or the state government or the national government using my tax dollars to support slavery directly or indirectly. And so the question comes for the local towns who in New Jersey I think are governed by something called the Local Government Contract Act, if I'm remembering correctly. I want that law and the regs that follow the law and the local governments to be able to say, look, we can, when we buy 10 police cars, or we go together with South Orange and we buy 20, or the state police buys 100, or whatever it is they're purchasing, we want to say to Ford or to General Motors or to whomever they're buying their cars from, tell us that there's no slave-made goods or products in your cars. What would that require? Now, at the national level, in 2012, President Obama issued an executive order strengthening, the essence, the title of which is strengthening government contracts to fight human trafficking, against human trafficking. And the essence of the order is to try to ensure that government contracts could look at slavery as something that they want the vendor to exclude from the product. In New Jersey, that law doesn't exist. All right. And so one of the things, if somebody says, I'm really interested in legislation, I'm really interested in change at the state level. I'm really interested in government procurement. There's an issue for you. Because how do we change the policies and procedures and laws and regulations, if necessary, of the state of New Jersey to ensure that the state, when they let a contract, can say to the vendor, we want you to represent to us that there's no slavery, saving goods in all your tiers. I don't want it's ridiculous to say, oh, we went over to Joe's warehouse and we looked and there's no slaves in Joe's warehouse. Please, give me a break. What we want you to do is go to whatever tier, however you do it, and something that can stand up to scrutiny, not just say, oh, we've got a box of fairy dust and we sprinkled it on our contract and we're sure there's no slavery. No. We want something that's verifiable, down to the field, down to the farm. And so that's certainly one way that folks can to engage in government. And of course, there's another whole way, which has to do with the investments by the state, or investments, which ties into what Mary Beth's world is in terms of when you're a shareholder. What do you say to the company that you own stock in?
Come back to Mary Beth, but let me ask Elizabeth a question. When I first started practicing law, agriculture was the second largest industry in the state. It's diminished in size as a portion of the economy, and much of it is in the southern part of the state. But then how would a person in South Orange or in this part of the state begin to understand or educate themselves about what's happening with, especially the agricultural labor force, either in New Jersey or in the region?
Well, it can be difficult.
You have to push it.
Let me turn that back on. Thanks. It can be difficult to know. One of the main problems that we have right now that's been highlighted across this panel is the lack of transparency. Forget about due diligence, that's a higher standard that we want, but there's not even transparency, which is very basic information that we need as consumers in order to make decisions. I looked over the Department of Labor's website just to get a sense of what the major products that are being harvested in the state are, agricultural products, and I see that most of the workers who come into the state of New Jersey on H-2A visas, which are the agricultural visas for less than a year, they're coming to work in nurseries and greenhouses. They harvest peaches, fruits and vegetables, peppers, and asparagus. Who knew? Eating a lot of asparagus here in New Jersey. But by and large, it can be challenging unless you're purchasing your fruits and vegetables directly from someone who's growing them. How can you know? But that's where you also have power as a consumer. You can begin to demand from the growers and from the buyers of those products. Ask for transparency. Ask for where they're sourcing things from. Ask them about the way their labor is treated. Ask the growers if they know how their workers got there and if they were charged fees before they came. You know, I think oftentimes growers, farmers, may not be aware of some of the abuses that are happening. I think sometimes they turn a blind eye, and sometimes they're very well aware of the abuses that are happening down the labor supply chain. But I think encouraging farmers and encouraging growers to look down that supply chain is a first step towards creating transparency so that all of us can make more informed decisions.
And there's actually a magazine called Supply Chain Quarterly. Mary Beth, I have two questions for you. The second is, tell us something about the question of this Tri-State Coalition for Responsible Investment. But first, it sounds like we've drifted into the realm of transparency. Now, California has a Transparency Act in business, but it's been widely criticized as constrained, constipated, and without teeth. I mixed the metaphor there away, I shouldn't have. You're focused on the question of maybe an act in New Jersey. What would it look like, and would it be different from California's?
Sure. So there's the California Supply Chain Transparency Act that was passed 2010, is that right? 2012. And essentially it asks certain businesses in California to disclose on their website broadly that they have an approach to dealing with supply chain management. It doesn't require that they take any particular steps. Elise has described some of the emerging laws in France and Australia and the UK that are asking corporations more information about their business operations, their supply chain, and really the governance and oversight of their supply chain, and then the systems they have in place to ensure they're effective. So information is key, but also effectiveness, to know that the systems they have in place are working, is key. So in our small subcommittee of the New Jersey Coalition, we've been considering how at the state level we might approach the issue around supply chain due diligence in New Jersey. It's really an exploration phase at this point, but looking at the different laws and regulations that are emerging around the globe, really, to try to get at what information is needed for consumers to make informed decisions, whether it's state level procurement or like me at the grocery store, and what information are companies compelled and required to provide to consumers about how they're doing business. So we're looking to see something that has requirements for certain kinds of action rather than something that's more about risk mitigation and more about driving positive impact.
And Dodd-Frank also had some provisions, which of course the industries fought significantly. Before Mary Beth answers my second question, it's not fair of me to have all the fun asking questions of these wonderful people. So there's a microphone here, and if you would like to ask a question of one of our panelists, please proceed to the microphone. Meanwhile, tell us about responsible investment.
Sure. So our organization is a coalition actually of Catholic institutional investors who have gathered together to use our investor voice and leverage. We were founded in 1975 and we're part of a broader investor community that wants to align our investment dollars with our values. A classic example is you don't want to work for peace and invest in a weapons manufacturer that's just at odds with your mission integration. So we have tools that we use to engage the companies in our investment portfolios to better understand their business, to encourage them to be more responsible. This movement that started as quite small now encompasses $8.7 trillion in assets under management. Not my coalition, but the broader economy that's looking at environmental. $8.7 trillion of U.S. invested assets are managed by people that are thinking about how they can make their investments more responsible. So when they're purchasing shares in a company, they're looking at environmental stewardship, responsible business practices, good corporate governance, and considering those factors when they're making investment decisions. So this movement is growing, and it's one of the important sort of leverage points that's driving business towards stronger investments in the systems they need to get deep into the supply chain and verify, and most importantly, pay workers at the bottom of the supply chain a fair and living wage, and not rely on exploited, essentially slave labor or child labor, so that they can make their goods more cost effective.
Yes. Can you tell us who you are?
Yes, certainly. I decided I would get up because you are having much too much fun.
I agree.
My name is Gail Richardson. I am talking right in.
We
yes?
can hear you. Can everybody hear in the back? Hear Gail? Go ahead. Go.
Thank you. I am a retired labor union leader in the state of New Jersey. And I've been retired for a few years, so I've stepped back from some of the fray. But my question to the panel would be, where are our labor leaders in regard to this very important issue? Over the years, I've taught some classes at Rutgers having to do with globalization and labor, and I got pushback from local labor organizations saying, basically, that's not our concern. And I kept saying, well, it is our concern because labor is now global, and if we stay very myopic in our view of the labor movement here in the United States, we die, and we are dying. So has there ever been any reaching out through your organizations to labor organizations in the state, and if so, what were your experiences?
I have not.
Elise, go ahead.
I don't work here in New Jersey, but the International Labor Rights Organization in Washington is very involved in this movement. The AFL-CIO is also very involved in this work. And the unions that I've met in France certainly are very involved in this work too. So you're absolutely right, they have to be involved. Understandably, sometimes at the local level, there's a discrepancy because they're just focused on the immediate interest of their workers and their supply chain, but the ones that are working internationally see the bigger picture. And I have a colleague who was the general counsel of one of the major car brand here in the US, and he was totally against unions. Then he traveled to India and he discovered child labor, and then he became super pro-union. So I think it's a matter of education. People need to be educated to the fact that the only way for these workers to get somewhere is to work together, that alone they have no leverage, and it really is a matter of leverage. And it's really a matter of education, I think.
Mary Beth?
Yeah, I just want to add, for us it's really important that the movement is worker-driven. So worker-driven social responsibility is going to be the most effective. If workers are organized, they know their rights, they have mechanisms to reach out. That's why the recruitment issue is really a challenge too, because there's often not direct employment. It's instead through a recruiter where you don't have access to like building an organized movement. But within the responsible investor community, there's definitely a presence of the labor movement. But if you have ideas, I think, how we can network more locally, I think we are really eager to do that.
Elizabeth?
Yes, I would add at the federal level, Centro de los Derechos del Migrante chairs something called the International Labor Recruitment Working Group, and we work very closely with union allies who are very, very strong and active members of the group. And we've found, as Elise said, we've found labor to be a really central piece of this work. And we're happy about that because in this political context in particular, this could be, in terms of labor migration, could be a divisive issue. But the AFL-CIO, for example, has managed to navigate that with grace in a very complicated time. And certainly the Solidarity Center looks internationally at the way that both labor migration and also supply chain, how the supply chains look globally. So we're really pleased to work very closely with labor partners.
Let me add. Well, let me add something to that. First of all, if you use the Boneberg pick-a-brick theory, that would be. I mean, there are a number of locals, 1199 and others, that have a history of being progressive in New Jersey. And one of the things we could do is reach out to them. In addition, Elise was the first Canadian, she was at the time, to chair an APA task force on business and human rights. Somehow they missed it. And then they said, oh my goodness, and then they dethroned her, but then she was an advisor. And then she became I don't know what she is now, but several very progressive labor folks came from the AFL-CIO. So I think one of the things we could do, if you want to continue to work with us and we can drag you out of retirement, is to start talking to laborers, because the other issue is we'll have to school ourselves on the relationship of trade policy, because clearly the global economy and trade policy, I mean, unions are really split. I mean, they supported Clinton and NAFTA, but some of them have been supportive of the incumbent on his trade, if you call them policies. And so I think to the extent that if you go, look, I was raised as a child of the Civil Rights Movement. A. Philip Randolph is the father of the American Civil Rights Movement, the sleeping car porters. When I grew up, Walter Reuther was one of the most forward-thinking people in the country. So labor has had a progressive wing that has been engaged in social issues for a long time. It's also true that starting in the 80s, government has waged a war on labor, so that from 50%, now it's down to 25% of the workforce that's unionized, and you have corporate interests that have to be engaged, like Walmart, who are opposed to labor. So that is another arena of struggle, but we can't do this without the support of workers, and it means we have to talk to labor and its leaders. So you raised a critical point. And I hope as we progress, because we hope this is the first of several gatherings, that you'll be with us as we try to figure out ways of approaching organized labor. I think there are friends there who we haven't hooked up with, and I think there are ways to do it. So I wanted to make sure that you didn't take this response as a lack of... Okay, good.
You are the brick.
We should all have a brick. By next meeting, everybody bring a brick. I'm sorry.
And if I just may interrupt just for half a second.
The brick man himself, the bricklayer.
I want to encourage folks to reach out to the organizations if you have an interest in our work, particularly the Slave-Free Commerce Committee of the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. We welcome participation. We welcome your engagement. And I understand that there's some students at Seton Hall University who are interested in carrying on this conversation on the campus and organizing themselves to see how the university might even build on the good things they're doing to address this issue. I encourage, as not a whole brick, but maybe a part of a brick, to come to these organizations. We welcome you.
And that's why there's also an IJP sign-up list, so you don't slip through the cracks. Because we're working with the coalition, and we're serious about this being not the last, but the beginning of a process in which we can build and broaden the base of this. I know of no one who says as a matter of principle, I love modern slavery. I know lots of people who want to ignore it or pretend it isn't there or don't know what to do. But we don't have a lot of natural verbal enemies, except those who, as the dean suggested, elevate profit over humanity. Excuse me, ma'am. Go ahead.
My name is Merle Kalishman, and I'm part of the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And as I'm standing here, I've gotten 87 more questions to add to my list. However, I'm going to look at Elise and say, maybe because I'm an educator by history, that the most important thing is education. Most of my questions have something to do with some kind of education. And every point that's been brought up today needs the first brick, has to be education. And we've all picked up the first brick because we're here. But I thought it was fascinating to find out that Tier 1 is the only one that has the contract obligation. So then how does a business go down to the other tiers to find that the conditions are what they want them to be?
The contract is the direct link. I mean, that's that's the
contract
direct.
is
No. It's the Tier 1. I mean, that's the company signs a contract with supplier number 1.
Right.
And usually supplier number 1 will sign the other contract with other people. I mean, sometimes you may have Tier 2 also, but the ABA business law section adopted some language, which is a lot for the ABA, on modern human trafficking. And the colleague that was working on that Ray knows, tried to go further than Tier 1, and he got a violent reaction that no, they are not going to go further down than Tier 1. These are business lawyers, so they understand what liability is.
Let me use a phrase that is helpful, because I think this is a really important question. And that phrase is due diligence. And that's why transparency has been resisted. So, for example, Dodd-Frank required companies that were dealing with minerals that came out of conflict zones to disclose. All it required was disclosure. And those companies kept Dodd-Frank in the courts and the D.C. Circuit for a very long time, resisting, because once you disclose and someone is saying, as Ruggie has, that you have a duty to be diligent, then you have to look down the supply chain. So you've asked the absolutely right question, which is how do we ensure that Tier 1 can't escape by saying the guys who put the building up in Rana Plaza violated building code, so it's not our fault that it collapsed? That is the question. And I think there are a number of proposed solutions, but a lot of it comes from what Bob is talking about, which is if there isn't bottom-up pressure, then all the Elises in the world and all of the legislative fixes don't work if there isn't popular pressure.
Okay, so I'll direct my next two questions at the same time.
I just want to add something to what you both said. The human rights due diligence is a tool. It's a tool that's been promoted by John Ruggie in his guiding principles, and it's getting some traction among other places in that new French law. That new French law is about that. It is about human rights due diligence. This is the first law of the kind that's promoting that. So already, I mean, it's something. Germany has said they will adopt the same law within 1 year if its companies don't start doing human rights due diligence on their own. We can see if they're going to do it on their own. If not, the Germans said, we will adopt a law forcing you to do human rights due diligence. There is a similar law that's coming up in Switzerland in a different form. So that's why I said the legal landscape is changing. And the people who are going to be able to apply pressure, beside the investors, which are key players, are going to be the boards of directors and officers. And once they understand that they will have a liability by not demanding more transparency, they will start moving.
There's one more tool that I would mention, and it comes to mind when we talk about Elizabeth's sort of Yelp. I keep calling it Yelp, but it's what I think of, which is a very old set of tactics involve naming and shaming and boycotts. That is, consumer companies, whether it's chocolates or
I'm old enough to remember
right.
that.
And you remember the grape, boycott grape, you may be too young for that, but Nancy remembers the grape
modern.
boycott. So the question of whether people band together, I know you remember the woman who made Bank of America change its policy with respect. She was a gallery owner, right? And Bank of America was charging people interest for transactions in their own savings account. And she started a boycott, which enlisted so many people that they changed their policies. United Airlines, when it violated the human rights of that passenger, was concerned about its exercising the powers of the state. Remember the Asian man who was beaten on the plane while they exercised the police power? So boycotts and an old practice of naming and shaming are not out of the game in terms of tools that can be used. I'm sorry, go ahead. You had 87 more
So
questions.
keeping it local,
Sure.
who's talking to our police departments in Essex County about their car purchases? Do you know? And who is doing the due diligence on the everyday products we buy at ShopRite or wherever?
Well, those are, let me deal with the first one first. I'm not sure who's dealing with Essex County Police Departments. I myself spoke to the mayor of Maplewood and said to him, I'm interested in this issue, let's talk about it. And his response was, our hands are tied up in the Local Government Contract Act, which regulates how local governments can let contracts. And I understand the theory of that. The theory is they don't want, is that the social policy at the time was that the state government, whoever that was, said these local governments may be run amok, letting contracts, we got to keep them under control, and this is what they can do and this is what they can't do. And so what we want to try to ensure, and that's part of what we're doing in our committee, our own due diligence within our committee, is how do those laws and regulations work? Can we take the handcuffs of local and county, city and town and county governments so that if the town of the village of South Orange or the township of Maplewood said, we want to have this as a criteria, they can make it a criteria, and then it would become up to the citizenry of these different towns to say, we want this to be a criteria. And the second question was again, how the products in your stores. There are, and we can guide you to this, various
I know the markings on some that are slave-free. There are
fair
products,
trade or something.
Fair trade,
right?
And some slavery-free. But the ones that haven't been,
there is no universal certificate of non-slavery in food products of which I'm aware, and it's a very complicated issue. So let's turn to the country of Cote d'Ivoire and chocolate, which is maybe makes 30-40% of the world's chocolate. And a small percentage of that chocolate it comes from slave worked farms. And then it goes into the stream of chocolate, and then it comes up to King's or ShopRite as Hershey's or Cadbury's or Mars or whoever it is. But is there a certification? No. Is that a problem? Yes. And so,
But there have been several chocolate conventions, and several of the largest distributors of chocolates in this country have refused to sign. And there have been some halting attempts at boycotts. They haven't really worked. But let me go back to the key premise that you advanced. Wanda and I, along with Elise and Lou, have been for the past 10 years lecturing to lawyers, business people, government officials. It's not an accident that we started this with a cartoon, not because you needed it, but because that's the basic. If you approach a typical mayor of a town of South Orange or Maplewood, he or she is going to be concerned about the potholes in the street, about daily activities that citizens bring up. Your need to first educate them about the issue, and then the next time you come, not go alone, but 10 of your neighbors. The education has to be fundamental. Try talking to a business leader who hasn't already thought about this, about the obligation of businesses to care about. See, this is not corporate social responsibility where you can pollute the stream and then build a home for kids next door. This is saying at the core of your business, what is its impact on human rights and what are you doing to address that concern? So that's a process of education and at least verbally confrontation. We talk to lawyers who have a hard time grasping this, all kinds of people. This is a new idea in the scheme of things, but it's a powerful and important one. And once people get it, it tends to trouble them because, as I said before, nobody is in favor openly of slavery. So I think that your point is even deeper than perhaps you let us know when you first made it, because education is a big part of it, and it isn't so easy to introduce a new concept to an old vocabulary that used to be just about profits. And then you add one other issue, which is if you go broader than just one state. For example, I don't know how many of you travel within the United States, but you know this is an expensive place to live, as opposed to Texas or other parts of the country where a house that you would buy you 5 times more house there. Right, so that means that wages are different, so that when you're looking at labor standards, you have to talk to local people and understand, and that's even more magnified outside the country. So these are not simple problems, but they are understandable problems, and the reason we brought you somebody like Elise and people like Mary Beth and Elizabeth is there are people we know who are experts in these areas, and it's working with them and developing the bricks that Bob's insisting on.
I'll keep bothering them. Thank you so much, and I hope you're still having fun.
Ma'am.
Hi. My name is Lynn Jacobs, and I wanted to bring in a little bit more local. Last year I had a group of friends, and we went to a spa in Teaneck, I believe it was, and it appeared to be closed, and about 3 minutes later, a van pulled up, and all these women got out, and they came in. They did not look happy. They were there to give us massages. Now, in a situation like this, to me, it looked like they were slaves and that they were being brought in, not against their will necessarily, but they were being forced to work. How would one handle a situation like that? If you call the police to report this, I went ahead, I had my massage, but, do you call the police? Is there an agency that looks into this? What's the option for a small person who's confronted with this?
Elizabeth, you want to start or no?
Just a second.
Well,
I can just.
Go ahead. And then Wanda, do you want to say something? No, because you have had a number of cases like this, and the police are seldom oriented towards this if it doesn't involve sex trafficking. Mm-hmm. If it's sex trafficking and you suspect that, then you can talk to the FBI or to the police. The
Right.
Department of Labor, if you get the right investigator, has this as its charge. And the right investigators sometimes are responsible.
So this is federal Department of
No,
Labor, not state.
we have a Department of
State.
Labor in the state of New Jersey, which is responsible for this. So the question would be to go to the Department of Labor. Also, NGOs. In this case, you could call Bob. I'm not being sarcastic, but say, who is it that's active in that area who we can use to mobilize to deal with this? Because just talking to the people themselves is difficult because they're under duress. Man, do you want to answer? Okay.
Yeah, that's what I want.
Slow down.
To call a
1-888. Okay, forget the one. I'm sorry.
Call the police.
Go ahead.
Twice, and then
Right.
these people are going to be deported.
And I would just add too that one way to go about it is to ask the workers, see if you can find a way to ask them, in a way that makes them comfortable, you know, maybe how, if depending on whether they appear to be migrant workers or whether, you might ask about their, where they came from today, if someone offered them a ride. You might ask, how long they've been living in the area. Start to see if you can build a sort of regular conversation that would build trust with the person. That's something that we do when we go on outreach. For example, last week we were over in Ocean City in Maryland to talk with J1 workers who come on the summer work travel program for a quote-unquote cultural exchange, but have often paid really exorbitant fees to come and work really long hours in exploitative conditions. So I think you can sort of feel out the situation. The reason that I would encourage that approach, depending on the circumstances and what you're seeing, is that you may be talking to workers who are perfectly happy with their circumstances, or who don't want any sort of disturbance of the situation. I'm not denying that there could be something horrible happening there, but I think it might, as a first step, it might be worth sort of mentioning options to the person after building a little bit of a relationship where they would feel comfortable telling you about what their circumstances are. That's one option, but certainly law enforcement is also another great option, and the human trafficking hotline is a great option too.
What's that number again? 888? Everybody got that? Everybody write it down? I saw some people were not writing down.
888-3737-888. Put it in your cell phone.
Sir.
So thank you so much for this. This has been wonderful to all of you. Really learned a lot.
What's your name?
My name is Jose Miranda. I'm Business Development Officer for BBZ Limousine. We're a corporate travel company. So you were talking to Mary Beth before, and this has taken an entirely new route for me. So I came here through the NJ Coalition Against Human Trafficking to try to get some information to get our chauffeurs trained on how to spot human trafficking. That's what I came here for. It's developed into something completely different. Through many organizations that I'm a part of, one of the things that have developed in my mind as I'm sitting here and I'm absorbing all this great information is, there is I'm going to bring it back down to local level, right? Because I know you guys said chocolate and I got hurt. I'm sure, we mentioned makeup and women cringed. It's just what it is. It's an everyday part of our lives. So through the organizations that I'm a part of, I'm also part of NLA, which is National Limousine Association. We actually try to bring more education to another word that's going to make everybody a little uncomfortable, Uber. They have been accused of unfair labor practices. It's something as simple as healthcare, minimum wage. When the word modern day slavery came out initially here in this room, that's the first thing I think of. Now, there have been also accusations that for third-party entities, organizations, whether it's terrorist organizations or black market organizations, drugs, anything like that, they've also been accused of recruiting people legally to come in, to get licenses, deeded with cars, payments they can't possibly make without working 15 hours a day. So that's just something that I had to come and ask. I'd love to come to the UN event that you mentioned, at least, just to see what's going on the state and federal level. Now, someone asked, what's being done. So organizations like the NLA and individuals as myself actually went to SBA advocacy not even a week ago, and that's where it all starts. It starts with corporate responsibility and federal level, because on a peer-to-peer level, it's fantastic. It's a solution that gives people money, it gets people from place to place at an inexpensive amount, which is fantastic. However, now it's come to the point where it's no longer a peer-to-peer. It's a B2B. It's a business to business. So you're talking about corporations making money off the back of people's time, blood, sweat, tears, however you want to call it. through the NLA, we try to get more people educated on that stuff, but it's also part of the corporate responsibility and educating buyers. So this is a factual statistic through Air Plus, they process credit card transactions. Only 18% of corporations who do travel hold a T&E policy to be able to use rideshare because of liability. Only 18%. It's a real statistic. Now, if you go around and you talk to business travelers, which I do all the time, that's what they use. And corporations are allowing to do that. France is one of the first ones in the entire world who has eliminated the process of using Uber through corporate. Private, I don't know whether or not that's still, but these are the things that the NLA has tried to, once again, just kind of educate buyers on that usage. Because again, at a peer-to-peer level, it's great. It's a fantastic solution. But now it's the time where they're just making money off of people unfairly. That's it. Thank you so much. And thank you again. This was wonderful.
Okay. So before we ask each of our panelists for a final thought for today, as I said before, this is not the last time. What we'll try to do is be organized to break up and look at each of several bricks in a more refined sense to see specifically what we can do. Is that a fair thing to say, Bob?
Yes.
We'll be doing the Boneberg brick by brick approach, right? And so when you're signing up and through email, let us know what bricks you have in mind, and we will try to approach that more effectively. So, Elise, I know you had at least another hour that you could have given us. What's the one thing that when you sat down, you said, I wish I told them about X? What was that?
Well, because I'm a lawyer, to me, it goes through the law. So we need to use the law in a better way than we've used it. I mean, the law has been used as enabling corporations to avoid liability, and courts have permitted that. So, for example, I mean, I discovered there was a law in the 70s that gave a social object to the corporation. The corporation was not just there to make profit. It had to have a social object. It had to take into account its shareholders, but also its stakeholders, its workforce, consumers. Now that doesn't exist anymore. All that they have is profit. And even in law school, lawyers are told that when they become fiduciary, they have to go after profit. So this is, to me, a huge problem. I think we have to lobby all our politicians to say that corporations are so important in this society, so powerful, so rich. They have to have some clear responsibilities and liabilities so that they cannot go free making all that money and never being accountable. We want politicians to be accountable, and they should be accountable too. So I think the law is a very important instrument that I'm trying to develop a framework with several other lawyers to show how to do that. I mean, my framework is not ready, but to map the legal liability so that people stop thinking, oh, I can do what I want, this is not liability. I think I've tried in my presentation to show that this is at the heart of the kind of world we want to live in, a world where human rights are respected, a world where democracy lives and flourishes, a world where the rule of law also flourishes. Right now we're living in chaos, and the stronger always get the upper hand, and so many people are left behind. And to me, it's not sustainable, because we can think of today, but where do we want to be in 10, 20 years? And we haven't spoken about the environment, but all these issues are totally connected to the environment. So the international rule of law is a reality. The environment is a necessity that we have to address. And I mean, the law is what can make a difference. Not just the law, but the law is an important tool.
So Before Mary Beth speaks, I wanted to mention something about being even more local. I'm sure many of the students here are aware that there is a movement to look at universities and especially the athletic gear. There are many universities that have prestigious athletic departments and prestigious athletic programs. Where do they get their gear? How is the gear made? What are the labor conditions? And as marketers become more sophisticated, I mean, I like Nike and the Colin Kaepernick thing, but what else is going on there? What else should we know about? So the question of being even more local, even if you're a student, which means you're maybe local away from where you reside or domicile. Mary Beth?
Sure. I think the most important thing that I would leave with the group is to ask questions, to think about where is this product from, what is in this. From my organization's perspectives, we're investors, so we ask the companies we're shareholders in, what is your human rights policy? How do you know it's effective? How do you cascade that down from your first tier to your further tiers? So that's the tool that we use, this shareholder engagement with companies, and we try to put pressure on them to improve their practices. Each of us are consumers every day, and so thinking about where you need more information about the products you're buying, whether it's a car or a chocolate bar or cocoa, for the most part, we can't give the list of clean products that are vetted because there hasn't been a framework created to share that information and to incentivize the collection of that information, let alone the payment of fair wages to the workers in order to have that clean workforce. So if each person starts to ask questions and prioritize ethical recruitment, fair labor, good wages, no child labor, no forced labor in the products that you buy, even though a company can't deliver those today, if there's the pressure and the groundswell that the consumer is willing to pay more for a product that's produced equitably, then the demand will require that the supply is there. So I think it's important for each of us to really ask questions. You can't be laden with guilt because the solutions aren't there yet, but I think engaging in the conversation every time you spend money is important.
So picking up on what Mary Beth said, I would hearken back to what the dean suggested, which is that to some extent you're here as a student to be educated and to some extent to prepare yourself in some ways for a modern workforce. And although Elise is correct in saying this is a 20-year arc during which these issues have been discussed, this is the cutting edge of a new arena for both occupation and civil engagement.